Picture this. So it's 1764. You're a wealthy, highly educated English gentleman, and you're living in this absolutely bizarre, custom-built castle-like house just outside of London.
Right.
And you wake up in the middle of the night just drenched in a cold sweat. You've just had a nightmare. But it wasn't just a standard bad dream. You dreamt you were standing on the main staircase of your own home, and looking down at you, resting on the uppermost banister, was this gigantic, disembodied hand clad in medieval armor.
I mean, it is such a wonderfully strange, terrifying image.
Yeah.
Just a massive metal-gloved hand completely invading your safe domestic space.
Yeah, and for most of us, we'd wake up, maybe, get a glass of water, try to shake it off, go back to sleep. But this man doesn't do that. He is so gripped by this bizarre, surreal image that he immediately sits down and starts writing. And from that single feverish dream, he writes a story that literally invents an entirely new genre. A genre that will eventually give us Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Edgar Allan Poe, The Haunted Corridors of the Bates Motel, and even the creaking, shifting stairs of Hogwarts.
It's the birth of the Gothic.
Right?
Right there.
Yeah.
Literally from a nightmare about a giant hand.
So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at a massive stack of sources. We've got university archives, detailed encyclopedia entries, architectural analyses, and even exhibition notes from the Victoria and Albert Museum, all to answer one very bizarre question.
Which is, how did this highly connected, deeply closeted 18th century politician use a bad dream to invent the horror genre?
Right. Our subject today is the man who had that nightmare, Horace Walpole.
And to really understand the answer to that question, we're going to look at a man who is just full of intense contradictions. I mean, he was an 18th century politician who absolutely hated public speaking.
A bad trait for a politician.
Yeah, completely. He was a relentless collector of historical oddities. And he possessed this absolute obsession with English history. We are going to explore how his fierce family loyalty and his deeply guarded secret personal life culminated in two world-changing achievements.
Right. The first being his bizarre physical creation, his custom-built little Gothic castle known as Strawberry Hill. And the second is his literary creation, that very first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto.
Exactly.
So before we can understand the, labyrinthine halls of this castle or the crazy plot of this novel, we need to know who is actually tossing and turning in that bed. Like, who is Horace Walpole, and what kind of world is he waking up in?
Well, Horace Walpole was born in 1717, and he was the youngest son of Sir Robert Walpole. Now, to an 18th century audience, that name means everything. Sir Robert Walpole is widely considered to be Britain's very first prime minister.
Okay, so for those of us whose British history is maybe a little rusty, what does being the prime minister in the early 1700s actually look like? Are we talking about a modern democratic leader, or?
Oh, no. Something else entirely. The role didn't even officially exist by that name back then. It was actually originally an insult thrown at him by his enemies.
Really? An insult?
Yeah. Sir Robert Walpole essentially monopolized the favor of two successive kings, George I and George II. He controlled the treasury, he controlled patronage, and he completely dominated the political landscape for over 2 decades.
Wow.
He was incredibly powerful, vastly wealthy, and highly controversial. His administration was often accused of massive corruption, maintaining power through bribery and this huge network of political favors. So Horace grows up right in the absolute epicenter of British power. Every room he walks into, the shadow of his father is already there.
I mean, that is an immense amount of pressure for a youngest son.
It is. But, it also comes with immense privilege. He gets the ultimate elite education, Eton College, and then King's College at Cambridge. Interestingly, though, he never actually finishes his degree.
Why not?
He doesn't need to. His father secures what were called sinecures for him.
Sinecures, like fake jobs?
Exactly. They were official public positions that came with a very healthy salary, but required absolutely zero actual work.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, his father just signed some papers, and suddenly Horace has a steady, substantial income for the rest of his life.
So he's basically an 18th century trust fund kid with extreme political connections.
Essentially, yes. And like any wealthy young gentleman of the era, he goes on the customary Grand Tour of Europe from 1739 to 1740.
Right. I've always heard about the Grand Tour. This was basically the 18th century version of a gap year for rich kids, right? They pack up some trunks and go drink wine in Italy.
That's how a lot of young men treated it, yeah. It was supposed to be an educational rite of passage, an exposure to the classical art and architecture of France and Italy. You'd travel with a tutor, cross the Alps, which was genuinely dangerous back then,
Yeah.
and spend months or years circulating in foreign courts.
Sounds like.
Yeah, and a lot of guys just used it to gamble and party. But Walpole uses it to feed this growing, almost ravenous obsession with the past. Our sources quote this really fascinating letter he wrote to his friend Henry Conway in 1740.
What's he say?
Well, Walpole is in Rome, and he's just devouring antiquities.
Mm.
He writes that he's, quote, far gone in buying medals, lamps, idols, and prints. And he explicitly says, I would buy the Colosseum if I could.
So he doesn't just want a souvenir to put on a mantle. He wants to own history itself. He wants to literally pack up the Colosseum and ship it back to London.
He had a completely voracious appetite for the visual and the historical. But eventually, the gap year has to end. He comes home and has to join the family business. When he returns, he is elected as a member of Parliament, a seat he holds for 13 years, from 1741 to 1768.
But the sources say he wasn't exactly giving fiery Winston Churchill-style speeches on the floor of the House of Commons?
No, not at all. Think about what the House of Commons was like in the 18th century. It was an incredibly brutal, rowdy, aggressive environment. You had hundreds of men crammed onto these wooden benches, shouting each other down, trading vicious personal insults. Walpole was intensely sensitive, highly educated, and rather delicate. He was temperamentally totally unsuited for the brutal, public cut and thrust of those debates. He just hated the spotlight.
So if he's sitting quietly on the back benches for 13 years, how is he wielding any of this political power his family is famous for?
Because he operated entirely behind the scenes. He was a pamphleteer, a massive gossip, a master networker, and a brilliant political strategist. And his political compass wasn't really driven by grand ideological theories about governance. It was driven entirely by fierce, unyielding loyalty to his family and his close friends.
Which brings up a really crucial point, because to understand the intensity of these political vendettas, we have to talk about his secret personal life. The encyclopedia source we're looking at points out a historical detail that was overlooked or maybe deliberately ignored for a very long time. Horace Walpole was homosexual.
Yeah, and it completely changes how you read his entire life. The source explicitly notes that almost all historical accounts of Walpole's political career just fail if they don't recognize his homosexuality.
Right.
I mean, in 18th century England, being a homosexual wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. It was a profound and deeply dangerous secret to carry, especially for someone in the public eye. Understanding this secret is the only way to understand his deepest, most venomous political hatred.
Yeah.
Specifically, his absolute burning loathing for two powerful political brothers, Henry Pelham and the Duke of Newcastle.
And normally, if you just read a standard history textbook, historians assumed, oh, Walpole hated the Pelhams because they deserted his father, Sir Robert, when his ministry was crumbling. Just, standard cutthroat political betrayal.
Right. The traditional narrative is that it was just Whig Party infighting. But the truth is much more personal and much more painful.
Yeah.
The Pelham brothers had a sister, Catherine Pelham. And in 1744, they arranged a marriage between Catherine and a man named Henry Fiennes Clinton, the Earl of Lincoln. And Henry Fiennes Clinton was Horace Walpole's one-time lover.
Just think about how devastating that must be. You are surrounded by the most powerful people in the country, but you're carrying a secret that could literally ruin your life. And then these political rivals essentially engineer a marriage that takes away the man you love, locking him into the rigid, heteronormative, aristocratic structure of the time just to secure their own political alliances. And you can't say a single word about the real reason you're angry.
Exactly. Walpole can't stand up in the House of Commons and say, you stole my lover. He has to swallow that grief. So his hostility isn't just about his father's legacy. It is deeply, painfully personal. And because he can't fight them in the light of day, he uses his pen as a weapon. He becomes an absolute master of the anonymous and pseudonymous political attack.
He's like a modern-day political fixer. He's a ruthless PR operative who operates entirely in the shadows, like an 18th century spin doctor. Instead of holding a press conference to denounce his enemies, he writes these devastatingly witty pamphlets to ruin their reputations without his fingerprints being on the weapon.
That is a brilliant analogy. And a perfect example of this shadow warfare is a pamphlet he wrote in 1757 called The Letter from Esso, a Chinese philosopher at London, to his friend Lian Shi at Peking.
Okay, set the scene for this pamphlet. What was the crisis?
Well, it was written during the controversy over Admiral John Byng. Byng was a British naval officer who failed to prevent the French from taking the island of Minorca during the 7 Years' War. The British public was furious. The government, which was led by Walpole's rivals, Henry Fox and the Duke of Newcastle, needed a scapegoat for their own military incompetence.
So they passed the buck.
Big time. They court-martialed Byng and sentenced him to death by firing squad. Walpole tried, unsuccessfully, to stop the execution. Why? Partly because he genuinely thought Byng was being treated unjustly, but largely because he wanted to embarrass his rivals who were using Byng to save their own skins.
So how does a pamphlet about a fake Chinese philosopher help save an English admiral?
By using the perspective of an outsider to point out the absolute absurdity of the situation. Letter from Zohar brilliantly mocked the hypocrisies of the British government. It pretended to be an objective, confused observer, noting how ridiculous it was that the British were executing an admiral for an error in judgment, while the politicians who poorly supplied him suffered no consequences at all.
Wow.
Yeah, and the pamphlet was a massive success. It went through 5 editions in 2 weeks. It established Walpole as a highly dangerous man to cross and print.
That is fascinating. So we have this man who is fiercely protective of his father's fading legacy, deeply wounded by a society that forced his personal life into the shadows, and wielding an incredibly sharp satirical pen. But he didn't just leave his revenge on the page, he literally built a physical monument to his obsessions. Which brings us to the architecture of revenge and his masterpiece, Strawberry Hill.
Right. This is where Walpole's obsessions with history, art, and politics become physical. In 1747, he acquired a small property, which he lovingly called a little plaything house in Twickenham, which is right by the River Thames, just outside of London.
Okay.
And over the next 5 decades, from 1747 to 1790, he transformed this modest property into a sprawling, asymmetrical, magnificent building known as Strawberry Hill. It became the premier defining example of Georgian Gothic Revival architecture in Britain.
And it wasn't just the outside that was spectacular, it was what he put inside it. We have the press release from a Victoria and Albert Museum exhibition about Strawberry Hill, and the collection he amassed is just mind-blowing. He had over 250 incredibly significant works. He had paintings by masters like Joshua Reynolds and Anthony van Dyck. He had this unrivaled collection of portrait miniatures tracing the entire history of the medium pieces by Hans Holbein, Nicholas Hilliard.
He was trying to collect the very essence of English history.
And some of it borders on the fantastical. It sounds like the inventory of a wizard's tower. He had a pair of gloves that he firmly believed belonged to King James I. He had spectacular golden parade armor that he thought belonged to King Francis I of France. He had a lock of Mary Tudor's hair. He had a comb supposedly belonging to the Anglo-Saxon Queen Bertha. He even had an Aztec obsidian mirror that had been used by Queen Elizabeth I's infamous astrologer and magician, Dr. John Dee.
I mean, it's an overwhelming collection. But to really understand the impact of Strawberry Hill, we have to pause and ask a fundamental question. Why Gothic?
Right, because today we look at a Gothic building and just think, oh, it looks like an old church. But what did it mean in the 1740s?
In the middle of the 18th century, the absolute dominant, respectable architectural style was Palladianism.
For those of us who aren't architectural historians, what exactly does Palladianism look like?
Think of a traditional government building or a very formal old-school bank. It was all about Greek and Roman classicism. It championed strict symmetry, massive white columns, rational proportions, and lots of natural light. It was considered the architecture of the Enlightenment. It represented reason, logic, and order.
Okay.
So to build something Gothic with pointed arches, jagged battlements, asymmetrical towers, and gloomy stained glass corridors was seen by polite society as barbaric, old-fashioned, and frankly, weird. It was the architectural equivalent of speaking in dead languages at a modern cocktail party.
So why does it do it? Why build a spooky, asymmetrical medieval castle when everyone else is building pristine, symmetrical Greek temples?
Because for Walpole, and for the Whig political party he belonged to, the Gothic style wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a deeply held political ideology.
Okay, unpack that. How is a pointed arch political?
Well, in the 18th century, the Whigs associated the Gothic style with the ancient Britons and Germanic peoples. They believed that these native, quote-unquote, Gothic tribes possessed a fierce independence. They believed these ancient peoples had a system of mixed constitutional government that protected individual liberty against the absolute power of monarchs.
I see.
So, to build in the Gothic style was to declare yourself a true patriot. It was a way of saying, I am a defender of ancient English liberty against foreign Catholic or tyrannical influence. A classical Palladian style was seen as foreign, imported from Italy and Greece. The Gothic was native. It was English.
Okay, so it's a political statement about English identity. But our sources reveal it was also a weapon in an incredibly petty yet grand architectural turf war.
Yes. To really see the spite in this architecture, we have to look at the feud at Stowe. Stowe was an immense country estate owned by Lord Cobham, and Lord Cobham absolutely despised Horace's father, Sir Robert Walpole. Cobham had actually been dismissed from his military regiment because he clashed with Robert Walpole over a controversial tax bill. So Cobham decides to exact revenge through landscape gardening.
Which is the most 18th-century aristocratic thing I have ever heard. Like, you fired me, I'm going to ruin you with shrubbery and pavilions.
It really is. Cobham builds an incredibly elaborate, emblematic garden at Stowe. It's essentially a political manifesto you walk through. He builds a pristine, beautiful classical structure called the Temple of Ancient Virtue, celebrating ancient Greek heroes and pure ideals. But right next to it, he builds the Temple of Modern Virtue. And he intentionally built it as a sham ruin.
A sham ruin.
Yeah. It's designed to look like it's crumbling and decaying, with broken columns and a collapsing roof, to symbolize the absolute corruption and decay of Sir Robert Walpole's current administration.
And he doesn't stop at subtle architectural metaphors. He puts a statue right next to this ruined temple, a decapitated statue. And everyone in England who visited those gardens knew exactly who the headless guy was supposed to be, Sir Robert Walpole.
Exactly. The architectural historian William Gilpin even wrote a guidebook to the gardens at Stowe in 1748, basically pointing to the statue and saying, "Look at this worthless fellow who got the fate he deserved." Horace Walpole actually visited Stowe, and he was livid. He wrote a letter to a friend saying he had no patience for, quote, building and planting a satire.
Hold on, I want to push back on this a little. Building a sprawling mansion like Strawberry Hill takes decades and vast amounts of money. Are we sure it was a direct retaliation? Isn't it possible he just liked the spooky aesthetic and the Stowe feud was just a coincidence? How do we know he was building out of spite?
We know because of the specific architectural choices he made and how he wrote about them. Strawberry Hill wasn't just a house. Architectural historian Saskia Beranek describes it brilliantly. Walpole built a secular sepulchre.
A secular sepulchre, so a tomb. A tomb for someone who isn't dead yet, or a tomb without the religion.
Precisely. Walpole used actual historical tomb architecture as the direct, literal models for the rooms in his house. The fireplaces, the ceilings, the doorways, they weren't just vaguely Gothic.
Right.
They were meticulously copied from the tombs of archbishops and royalty at Westminster Abbey and Canterbury Cathedral.
Seriously?
Yeah. For instance, the intricate design for his library bookcases was directly modeled after the side screens of the tomb of Prince Arthur in Worcester Cathedral.
That is wild.
He is literally taking the sacred spaces where England buried its greatest heroes and turning them into his living room. He's enshrining his father's memory, validating his family's lineage, and essentially building a massive monument to say the Walpoles are the true defenders of British history. You build fake ruins, I build monuments to eternity.
And there is this amazing detail in the sources that proves exactly what was on his mind. In 1749, Walpole writes a letter to his friend George Montague about the battlements he is planning to add to the roof of Strawberry Hill. And he quotes the Bible. He quotes a specific verse from Deuteronomy. "When thou makest a new house, then shalt thou make a battlement for thy roof, that thou bring not blood upon thy house, if any man fall from thence."
Which seems like a very weird, specific verse to quote when discussing home renovations.
Right.
But if you decode it, and biblical commentaries from the 18th century confirm this interpretation, the battlement isn't just to stop a roofer from physically falling off the edge. It's a metaphorical barrier to protect your house, your lineage, from judgment and ruin.
Right.
His father, Sir Robert, had fallen from power in a massive wave of public controversy and accusations of corruption. Horace is saying, I am building a new house, a Gothic fortress, with metaphorical battlements to protect my father's fallen legacy from the judgment of enemies like Lord Cobham.
That completely answers my question. It wasn't just an aesthetic preference. Instead of complaining in a diary, he spends 50 years building a massive, sprawling Gothic castle out of architectural spite to prove a point.
That is exactly what he did. He reclaimed the Gothic style from the Garden Follies, where his enemies use it as a joke, and made it serious, monumental, and entirely about his family's enduring legacy. He literally built a physical fortress against the anxieties of his life.
But the thing about building a spooky, gloomy fortress filled with historical artifacts and medieval tombs is that, well, you have to live in it. You walk through it at night, surrounded by the weight of history, dark wood, stained glass, and the ghosts of England's past. And one night in 1764, all of that atmosphere, all of that carefully curated gloom crept into Walpole's subconscious, and it birthed a literary revolution.
Yeah.
So Walpole goes to sleep. He has the dream, the gigantic hand in medieval armor resting on his own staircase.
Right. He wakes up, Terrified, but incredibly inspired, and he starts writing frantically. In just a couple of months, he finishes The Castle of Otranto. It is universally regarded as the very first Gothic novel.
I want you to walk us through the plot of this book because it is wild. It makes modern fantasy look incredibly tame. Where does the story even begin?
So we're in the medieval Castle of Otranto, somewhere in Italy. The lord of the castle is a man named Manfred. Manfred is a cruel, dictatorial ruler. He's currently preparing for a massive event, the wedding of his sickly, weak 15-year-old son, Conrad. Conrad is supposed to marry a beautiful, noble princess named Isabella.
Okay, classic setup.
It's entirely a political marriage, meant to secure Manfred's hold on the castle, because Manfred is terrified. There is an ancient prophecy hanging over his head.
What does the prophecy say?
The prophecy states that the castle and lordship of Otranto will pass from Manfred's family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it.
Which is such a strange, specific phrasing. Grown too large to inhabit it.
Very strange. So it's the wedding day. Everyone is getting ready in the courtyard, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a gigantic helmet-like, the size of a small house, covered with massive black sable feathers, falls from the sky and crushes Conrad to death in the courtyard.
Literally just squashes the groom on page 2. A giant hat falls from the sky and kills him. How does Manfred react to his teenage son being flattened?
His reaction is entirely unnatural, which is part of the horror. He barely mourns his son. Instead, he immediately realizes his bloodline is in danger. Without a male heir, the prophecy will come true. So he decides, right then and there, looking at his son's crushed body under a giant helmet, that he is going to divorce his current wife, Hippolyta, who he blames for not giving him strong heirs, and he is going to marry his dead son's fiancée, Isabella, himself.
Which is horrifying. He's forcing himself on this young woman, and Isabella obviously wants no part of this, so she runs. This leads to a scene that basically defines the Gothic genre. She escapes down into the dark subterranean vaults and trapdoors beneath the castle. And while she's fleeing this sexual terror in the pitch black, a ray of moonlight shines through a trapdoor, and she gets help from a handsome peasant named Theodore.
Right. And Theodore had actually been locked up by Manfred earlier that day, because Theodore, looking at the giant helmet in the courtyard, correctly pointed out that it looked exactly like the helmet missing from a giant statue of an ancient prince in the local church. Manfred, being a paranoid tyrant, accused Theodore of sorcery and threw him in the dungeon. But Theodore escapes, helps Isabella through the trapdoor, and gets her to a nearby church, where a friar named Jerome protects her at the altar.
Manfred must be furious.
Beyond furious. Manfred marches to the church, demands Isabella, and orders Theodore to be executed right on the spot. But right as Theodore takes his shirt off for the executioner, Friar Jerome sees a distinct birthmark on his shoulder in the shape of a bloody arrow. And Jerome gasps and realizes, wait, this is my long-lost son. He is not a peasant. He is of noble birth.
It's a classic, incredible soap opera reveal. So Jerome begs for his son's life, but Manfred is completely ruthless. He essentially holds the boy hostage and tells the friar, you either give me Isabella or I kill your son.
Exactly.
But before they can resolve this impossible standoff, a trumpet sounds outside the castle. A mysterious group of knights arrives, bearing a massive sword that matches the giant helmet. They are led by a knight named Frederick, who turns out to be Isabella's long-lost father. And Frederick claims he has the true ancient right to the Castle of Otranto.
At this point, the plot becomes incredibly tangled. Theodore is freed from his cell by